Hi, Dragana.
Hi, Eugene. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you? I saw that you tried to join us hour before, and it's because yesterday there was a change of the time in United States and Canada. I know that in Europe there is no change of the time. I think it will be in 2 weeks from now. So
Yes,
sorry
I
for
was
that.
I was nervous about missing the meeting, so I tried.
No, I understand. Sorry for that. It's just like probably we should have I don't know, send some kind of a message that there is a time change.
Yes,
In,
Anna actually said that there is a
ah,
time change, and I know that we changed time, but
okay.
I wanted to check anyway.
You were not alone who actually tried to join our earlier. I saw that somebody else. I hope that another person will come as well. It's it's this time of the year when there is a change of the time. It's always confusing.
I know.
Okay, so I'm glad that you managed to come, and thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you.
Hi. I don't hear you. You're muted.
Hi, yeah.
Saying
Hi.
hi.
I'm just talking to Dragan that there is a time change yesterday in United States and Canada, and I saw that some people tried to come
Oh,
1 hour earlier, but I hope they will come now. Like Dragon tried to do that, and somebody else.
ah, yeah. And I try to put in all our announcements that there
Yeah.
will be a time change.
Yeah, I know. It's
Oh, that's what happens always.
yeah, it's always like, especially immediately after that. Let me see who tried to also join.
I see.
Kristen also tried to join.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wow. Okay, Sifan, welcome.
Haven't seen you for a long time.
Yeah.
Yes, I've
Yeah.
been missing. My wife actually joined for, I can't remember what it was, but she joined it, and I think she's trying to connect now as well.
Mhm.
Good.
Good, nice, great. Hi, Melissa. Hi, Kristen.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. You as well. Sorry, I don't have a camera running. Mine's kaput.
Oh, oh, sorry for that. Hi, Dina.
Hi,
Nice to see you.
same here. Been a long time.
Yeah. Maybe we should wait another 2 minutes and then start. Hi, Mark. He's just connecting. Hi, Mark.
Hi, how are you? I'm doing some things in the background, but I'm here.
Okay, nice. Very good. Hi, Dilipa. Hi. Okay, we'll soon start. Okay, good. All right, well, now that recording is in progress, welcome everybody for coming to our open symposium on the special issue of dialogic pedagogy and democratic education. We'll talk about the terms too. And let's find out who we are and introduce each other, and then we'll talk a little bit about how this special issue came about and what we wanted to do. Maybe some other of our authors will join us, but it's always very hard to put everybody together in the same time. So welcome, welcome. And on my right is Melissa. So Melissa, say a few words about yourself and choose another person then.
All right, I'm Melissa Bradford. I teach at DePaul University in educational leadership, and I'm also a founder of Tallgrass Sudbury School, a democratic school in the Chicago area. And I'll toss it over to Dina.
Yes, so I'm Dina. I am from Russia, but I live in Uganda for 3 years now. And I'm very interested in the topic, but not an author and haven't read it.
Okay. And who are you choosing?
And I choose Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, hi there. Mark Smith. I'm a professor at Kane University out in New Jersey. I live in New York City. Very interested in the democratic education, particularly when it comes to social and interpersonal relations. So that's my interest area in that. And let me see if I can pass it over to, how about Dilipa?
Hi, so I'm Dilipa from Sri Lanka. So we run me and my husband, he's also on the call, is running a democratic school, and that's fun. He's also in my democratic school. So these days we're going through this situation. We're trying to explain what democratic education is as opposed to what a democratic government is. And often somehow people tend to confuse it, or maybe it's not a confusion. So it's an interesting place to be.
Thank you. And
I pass it on to Dragana. Did I get the name right?
Dragana. Mhm.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dragana Martinovic. I'm from University of Windsor, Canada. I am a mathematics educator and interested in the topic.
Thank you. And choose somebody.
Okay, so let me see. I think I will choose Eugene.
Thank you, Dragana. My name is Eugene Matusev. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. My interests are in democratic dialogic education. I'm one of the authors on that special issues. Was very helpful for me because I reflected on many issues. Well, let me pass to Kristen, to you.
Hi, I'm Kristen Morrison. I'm a professor in the School of Teacher Education and Leadership at Radford University, although I'm currently a visiting professor at the University of Greifswald in Germany, northern Germany, up along the Baltic coast. And while I'm here, I'm teaching about educational alternatives with a particular focus on democratic preschool, and then also doing field work out at a very, very rural democratic free school in the town of Klein-Yazado.
Thank you, Kristen. And now I think the only one who is left is Sifan to tell us about himself.
I'm from DiaPed, my wife, so together we are running this democratic school called in the Republic of Sri Lanka. Over 3 years old, but it's been a struggle with all the pandemic-related closures and things like that. So, we say we are the first and only democratic school in Sri Lanka, so we are obviously very interested in the topic and Eugene and what's happening in the forum and things is one source of our information to sort of further our understanding of things.
Okay, thank you, Sifan. Yes, the question is what democratic schools are. As Dilipa said, it's hard to explain to people who don't know. And I think on this call, probably all people know what democratic schools are in some way, but maybe not in the same way. And maybe some know less, or so it's very interesting how we would define it. When we issued a call for papers for this special issue, which was a long time ago, in the end of 2018, actually, out of like 35 people who responded, maybe 2 people had a proposal to study something in democratic schools. Most other proposals were about democratic education or education for democracy in otherwise conventional or progressive schools. And it was very puzzling to us. And I think that democratic education is unknown to most educators. Like if you go to AERA, which is American Association of Research of Educational Research, I don't know if 5 people would know about education, democratic education there. This is not true for all the countries in the world. Like, for instance, I went last year to Israel to study democratic education there, and everyone in Israel knows what's democratic education because they have a huge amount of democratic schools per students there. The question is whether they all work in the same way or whether they have a good reputation or not. Eugene, please. Please unmute yourself. Mhm.
Thank you. I want slightly disagree with you. It's not about people don't know what democratic education is. It's my understanding, my take on that is there a different understanding what it means. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's wrong about understanding of that, or somebody doesn't know what it is. It's just like people have a different understanding. And based on this work on this special issue, was very helpful for me. I pick up at least 5 types of understanding what democratic education is. And they're different, and it's very important to engage in that. By the way, that 5, it's only as a result of working on these special issues. There might be even more than 5. I'm not saying that. And let me go from that 5. So one of them is democratic education is understanding as a curriculum, which is about it's a kind of education about democracy. And this type of education is done in many different countries. It's just about, sometimes they call civic education, part of that. In different countries, it has a different name for that. Like, for example, in Soviet Union, when I studied that as a student there, it was called, I'm trying to translate from the Russian, it will be called a kind of science about society, обществоведение. And we studied about democracy, by the way, as a critique of democracy. And it's kind of bourgeois democracy and stuff like that. And that's one of understanding. So it could be, by the way, with positive or negative evaluation of this. There is another type of the democratic education that I pick up from this working on this. It's kind of education. It's not as a curriculum, as a target that it's kind of preparation for democratic participation in the society. This is it could be related to as a curriculum or could be different. But the idea is to focus on preparation students to a democratic participation in the society. So, for example, it will be much more practical. Like, for example, let me give a specific so you can visualize that. It could be more participation in election. It's very popular in the United States that during the election time, some schools engage children or students in kind of mock elections. They study issues of election issues, like, for example, it could be about last election about Trump and Biden, and students studying agendas and promises of the Trump and Biden, discuss them, debate them sometimes, and participate in the end of the mock elections. This is one of the examples. That's different from studying about the democracy. So but again, there could be overlap between them. So next one is less common, but it's happened. And in our special issues represented by Armando article, it's the idea that democracy can be a problem solver. For example, in the school, and Armando described that it's not only school, it's like working with troubled youth in Brazil. The children experience violence and produce a lot of violence. And one way to address that problem of the violence among children, and this is, again, very particularly traumatized children. I wish Armando were here and you can, or you can read about his wonderful chapter about that. So the idea is that democracy is a problem solver. It's a tool to solve problems in this particular case of violence, but there could be some other issues. It could be like alienation from the education or some other issues. So it's, again, it's the idea is that democratic education, it's in a sense that using democracy for solving particular social and sometimes educational problems. Now, the fourth way of understanding, and this is more common to the what's so-called democratic schools, is the idea that there is a governance and decision-making, collective decision-making is done in democratic ways in that particular school. And this is like, so this is a way of decision-making and self-governance democracy. So this is the fourth, and this is heavily related to a narrow sense understanding of democratic schools. Now, the fifth one that I also pick up, and it exists, again, there is a lot of overlap. The fifth one, this idea that education is understood as self-education. And this is a democratic education, is understanding that education is understood as self-education. Again, it's not necessarily true in all even so-called democratic schools of this type of understanding, but nevertheless, that understanding present and it exists by itself. And sometimes it's in conflict with the principle, the self-governance, because democratic self-governance, because the idea is that sometimes collective decision-making interfere with this notion of idea that education is self-education and like getting on that territory. So the fifth types, I pick up that from working on this special issue, and in this case, kind of well, finished with that. But again, in my understanding, I would not say that people don't know what democratic education is. They have different idea what it's, I'm sorry, from democratic education. They have different ideas about that. And I think it's extremely important to continue this work, trying to pick up even more probably understanding of that, more than 5 that I listed. Again, my work comes only these 5 types in work on these special issues. It's not like it's easy to look at the literature, and maybe there is even more than 5.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eugene. Yes, there are, and there are different, not only understanding, but different shapes and forms of various democratic schools that also came as a result of our studying of the special issue, and independently of whether dialogic pedagogy or dialogic education has different roles in them, in themselves, just independently, they may vary. Yeah. So that was one of the very interesting findings that we found out. The whole idea for the special issue came exactly because we were, we all had at some points of times experienced problems in feeling completely free, as another author of our special issue, Jim Rietmulder, said. We are in the higher education contained. We don't have a full freedom. We are in the cage with our dialogic pedagogy, while he is in a free range situation in his school in Harrisburg. And so we were trying to figure out what kind of approaches to education and educational environments are fostering and enabling dialogic pedagogy better than the others. Because in all kinds of educational approaches, dialogue to some exists. It depends in what ways, for what reasons, and how distorted it is. It's always there. That's the nature of human existence. And we were trying to figure out whether democratic education always goes together with the dialogic education, dialogic pedagogy, or are there any tensions between the two, or just not even tensions, like independence from each other. So that was another theme in our studies. What else can I say? There is a lot of about transitioning between conventional education into the democratic education. That was the whole study that I did about the Scandinavian or Norwegian high school that was founded in 1967 by the Norwegian high school students, and with the help of the University of Oslo. And their huge search about what's the right way to conduct their school, and how they imagined and their own visions of what schooling is and how it should be done. So we found a lot of differences among them and their paradigms as governors now of their own schools came into clashes, especially at the beginning. We can talk more about that because they were, maybe we could say, colonized by the conventional or progressive school. It was a transition, even in general, I think in the 60s, from the conventional to progressive schooling. That was the movement in general in the whole world, but not into democratic school as a self-governing school, where the students govern together with the adults or even alone without anybody else. And so that was very interesting to find out what are all these paradigms of what education is, what it should be, and at least my discovery of the difference between a liberal democratic school and illiberal, let's say, democratic school, or different forms of freedom that maybe exist, or understanding of what freedom is. Here is Jim. He just joined us. Hi, Jim. He is one of the co-authors of this special issue, and it was, I can say that the whole idea maybe starts from a very, very long and time ago, and a long discussion between Jim and Eugene and me, Mark, and some other people who are connected to the University of Delaware and Dialogic Pedagogy in a Bakhtinian sense, and our search for what's going on in Jim's school and what's going on in our approach to higher education and democracy in higher education. So that was a huge email chain that went for maybe 2 or 3 years, hi Jim, about various issues that later on became some of the guiding topics and themes for the special issue. And so one of the articles.
Hello, all.
Hi.
Apologies for my lateness.
Oh, no problem, no problem. You are still in time, just when we, there is this saying, just as we talk about the wolf, wolf appears. So we learned a lot, Eugene and I, Mark, Kathy, and some other people, huge things from hanging out with Jim. And Jim also, I think, I speak in your mouth, but you're here.
Yeah, why is it constantly jumping that? I apologize, but I thought it me, but I think there is some problem with the Zoom now because it's constantly recording, not recording, something like that. Anyway, I just want to address both things. One is Dragana's comment. She asked to elaborate about dialogic education, non-dialogic education and stuff like that. And exactly conversation with Jim. Let me tell you very interesting, and my discoveries in working on, personal discoveries in working on this special issue about with the terms of this dialogic education, dialogic pedagogy. The reason I came to democratic education, and I came to democratic education in the 4th and 5th understanding of that as self-governance and as self-education, both of them. But I came to that through my interest in dialogic pedagogy back then. And the problem was, I'm a scholar of Bakhtin, this Russian philosopher of dialogism, and I tried to translate his ideas in education for some time and practice them in my own teaching. By the end of, let me tell you, by 2010, probably around this time, I started experiencing something that actually I was experienced a long time ago, but I think 2010, I came to a reflection on these tensions that I experienced that. it's the problem was it's very difficult to create human dialogue like what Bakhtin or Martin Buber talks about, like man to man, which is in English sounds like a little bit sexist, but it's not sounds like that in Russian or I don't know how it's in German. In Martin Buber sense, but you can get the idea. It's very difficult to do it in the conventional institutions where everything is assigned to the students, including dialogue itself that I try to practice. And I more and more come to realization that dialogue that I really kind of envision or really has a lot of nostalgia for, it's only possible dialogue among free people. And these free people, and I started feeling that I'm actually part of this very oppressive system myself, very actively participate in that with all these assignments that I bombard my students with. And I started moving away from this notion of this trying to practice dialogic education within conventional institutions. And I started coming with the notion of the democratic education. And at some point, I actually experienced a revolution in my class, but I was prepared to this revolution because I was actually hoping for this even revolution to happen. And it was dethrowing of me in one of my classes, which was 2010 happened. And I'm actually embraced that. Basically, my students raised the question, why the hell we need to study what you think is important? We should study what we think is important. And I was like, wow, this is a great thing. So what do you want to study? And they say, we don't know. And which led me to start creating this, what I call curriculum map. But anyway, at the same time, I become interested and start searching for this dialogic, from this democratic education. And fortunately, I think for Anna and from some other people, we found in different ways. I think, Jim, you was found from different sources, I think. It's Scott Richardson also was at that time, he was a graduate student at the University of Delaware, trying to do this, what he called crazy experiments. And I had this revolution in my class of dethrowing me. So I was kind of searching in summer, next summer, I was searching for something. Anyway, but let me tell you how long the journey took. I just only in 2012, actually with Mark, we started doing that 2011. We started trying to establish a journal of dialogic pedagogy. And when we establishing in 2012, or when it's actually was established 2013 in January, but we did it 2012. One of the big debates was among people who were interested in this endeavor. What's the name of the journal should be? And there's two most popular names were dialogic pedagogy versus dialogic education. Unfortunately, now I think it's from 2012 to 2022, 23. I feel I'm joined this group for dialogic pedagogy. And unfortunately, we won through the democratic decision making. And now I feel it's such a bad idea. And while working on these special issues, I look at our journals, what it's about. And it's so shocking for me to discover that text, that probably I wrote it, or at least I participate in writing that actively. It says basically that the whole focus is on the teachers. As if education, it's understandable why, because it's pedagogy. And pedagogy is about teaching, or at least not necessarily about teaching, it's about accompanying a student. You know, the word pedagogue, you will be surprised, but it's a Greek word, which means actually a slave who accompany a child to school and sitting there, so to protecting that from bullying of peers and adults. But it's a slave who accompanying a student, which is interesting etymology. And through this, actually working on this work, on this special issue, I started thinking that I'm right now not in favor of dialogic pedagogy. I'm in favor of dialogic education. and I'm surprised, like, why does it took me so long to realize that? But that's actually the whole trajectory of realizing that dialogue can only possible among free people, and free people requires democracy and taking ownership for their own life, and the focus should be on not on pedagogy, but on what actually this is Jim's ideas. Who I think, Jim, you articulated at least in your recent book. You wrote a very important thing that almost all other type of education focused exactly on pedagogy, how to teach, on instruction, curriculum, and stuff like that. And your school is focusing on organization of collective life together, or what you would even better to say, scale down society, democratic society, I would say, and I would say leisure type of the society. But anyway, this is what I'm learning in this work on this I almost say book. This is a book. Special issue. I just realized one of my realization that I'm moving away from dialogic pedagogy to dialogic education. Now, in terms of what understanding of that, this is also in this conclusion, I provided different understanding of dialogic education or pedagogy, but I talk about education. And I would find there is big two type of this. And again, it's mentioned in this chapters, as in our chapters. You see, I'm thinking about it as a book, and I think it is a book. It's just like published as special issue. So anyway, one, it's an instrumental idea of dialogue. It's kind of dialogue is helpful for non-dialogic purposes, like, for example, increasing test scores, for example, or increasing students' engagement, like working against alienation and things like that. And this is, I call, instrumental dialogic pedagogy. In this case, it's very correctly to use the word pedagogy. And there is another way of thinking about dialogue as a self-goal. It's about that, because dialogue is a core of the meaning making. So meaning making is a dialogic process. It's always like answering to somebody's question and responding to somebody's question they're taking very seriously. And it's also part of some kind of particular dialogic relationship. And so this is another way of understanding dialogue. That's ontology. The dialogue is ontology. And that's very different type of dialogic pedagogy or education. And within an ontological approach, there is what I call conservative and democratic approaches within this dialogic education or pedagogy. Conservative is exactly what I was before 2010, which is I try to include dialogue in otherwise conventional, without actually raising this question that, Jim, you're constantly thinking about, how to organize, to think about society is where education can happen. And in this case, it's dialogic pedagogy still. And then it become democratic dialogic education, when the focus become of, again, of three people, three citizens of that society that engage in dialogue as a kind of part of their life together. So again, Dragon, I don't know if you have more questions about that, feel free to ask. And the non-dialogic education in general, I would say that it's education that doesn't care about the dialogue. That's very easy to answer to this question. And in my view, education has definitely can have non-dialogic aspects of that, and can be non-dialogic. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. There's certain part of the education can be non-dialogic, and there's nothing wrong about that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Jim, you want to join and want to add something, or not only add something, but start your own theme.
I'm happy to answer any questions and respond. as invited, but I have nothing particular to add at this point. I guess I would say that that I think of dialogue as a natural development in community or society. And so education through both collective and interpersonal dialogue is the way I would say the power of education at the Circle School.
Mhm. Dragana, you raised. Mhm.
Yes, I raised the hand. Actually, what I would like to question is what Eugene just said, the difference between dialogic education and dialogic pedagogy. He thought that moving from one to another is in a way opening more questions, which I agree with. But I think the biggest problem is actually in accomplishing dialogic pedagogy. Because you see, on one hand, you are talking about freeing students, but I think that teachers are not free. Teachers are kept on certain tasks. They are focused. They have to focus on curriculum. They have vice principals, principals, superintendents. As I usually say, it took me some time to realize that school education is run like an army. It's literally an army. And you always have your supervisor whom you need to listen to. And then ultimately, superintendents need to listen to the ministers and so on. So there is always somebody in chain of command who stifles what you think you can do. Now, in my work with teachers, I always try, and not only teachers, but school leaders, I always try to show them that actually their scope of freedom is much bigger than they think. They always think that they need to ask somebody for permission. So in my work and writings based on school data, giving yourself a permission, as they say, was a big thing. So I'm just questioning now, how do you see that relationship between pedagogy and education?
Mhm. Well, one thing again, I start understanding in my work again, in our rather sometimes heated debates with Jim and with other people, but Jim is so helpful because of Jim, I would really admire your tolerance to disagreements, which is very, very helpful, at least for me. Because, you know, many things you can fully understand only through disagreements, or not fully understand, but please start understanding. Like, for example, one thing that one of the chapters, you know, I will use that as I'm treating our special issue as a book, you know, let me stop even apologizing for that. I call it chapter. One chapter that I wrote was called Benevolent Dictator. And this is actually a quote from Jim. He called me benevolent dictator. Initially, Jim, I want to admit that it was not pleasant for me to hear that, and I actually completely disagree with that. But the more I start thinking, the more not only I agree with that, but I find that extremely important to accept that. It's almost like, Jim, it's like a metaphor is like that. It's somebody who is alcoholic. Somebody tells that person is alcoholic, and of course, not of course, but many people will immediately say, I know some of my friends, unfortunately, no, I'm not. I can stop at any time. Like, I'm not. And it takes a realization to, no, you are alcoholic. And that's part of recovery. And in my view, it was also helpful for me to start recovering in a way of this dictatorship. Not because I will be not dictator, but it's very important to realize limitations, needs, even use of that dictatorship, or why does it happen, and so on and so forth. But one part of dictatorship is like, I'm positioning myself before that I'm a teacher, right? But who told me that I'm a teacher? Just because institution told me and said, this is Eugene Matusov will be a teacher of that particular class does not make me a teacher. And I started thinking, like, what does it mean to be a teacher? And to some degree, it's a very simple answer. A person becomes a teacher only when another person find this person useful and ask for help. And only that time, when they stop asking for help, you stop being a teacher. It is very simple, obvious, but it takes so much time to realize that because of that institutional distortion. That I'm actually only a teacher become for some students for some time, only when they need genuinely need my help. When they decided, when they trust me, when they find useful, and when and so on and so forth. And there is huge distortion of that. And there is huge distortion, like for me to realize that, again, when you start thinking not about, forget about thinking about pedagogy, but start thinking about the democratic way of thinking, you start thinking like administration, for example. Administration should help me, like administration become my administration when they can provide. First of all, I need their help, and they will provide that, like with logistics, with managing funding, or many other things. And then only then they're my administration. Other than they're not my administration. So the whole thing is distorted. Like my administration is the same, in my view, the same kind of functions as janitor in my university, because they help to prepare a lot of that education happen. Like I'm helping my students. The primary thing is my students. When they ask my help, and not necessarily they need my help, or they trust me even, or they can find help with somebody else. When they need my help, I become their teacher. Then everybody else provides support. As soon as they provide support, they're great people. Like we have wonderful janitors, and sometimes there is wonderful administrators. But the problem is they constantly distort things. They think that I'm serving them. Like I before thinking in a way, my students in a way serving me, because I'm defining what's good, what's bad. My administration constantly should come to me and said, like, how can we help you facilitate, and the students as well? How we can help you? Like, what else do you need, and so on and so forth. And right now, everything is distorted. And I'm not sure we need even Ministry of Education or something like that, unless, again, they start treating it like that. How we can provide resources for that, how can we facilitate things, and so on and so forth. And everything is distorted. And by the way, historically, I just want to finish it. It was not like that, especially at the university levels. You will be surprised, but one of the first universities in Europe were emerging like University of Students. The rector of university, or president of university, also would be only a student. And they make contracts with the professors who were serving to the students. At the parallel, that was in Southern Europe. In North Europe, a little bit later, they emerged University of Masters. They were called University of Masters. This is where professors rule, but not administration. The professors were in charge. Everything was done through the professors. We have now time in 19th century up when it became a university of students or school of, no, I'm sorry, schools of credits. Everything can become about credentialism, which come top down. That's why it's top down approach, because the credits rule, which is bureaucratic kind of things. And that's why there is ministries created around this managing of these bureaucracies. Okay, that's
okay. Kristen, please.
Yes, so Eugene, I really enjoyed that article about the benevolent dictator piece. But given what you've been talking about what defines a teacher, I was wondering if you could help me to conceptualize a little bit more of what so in your article, you talk about the open syllabus and how in the past, some students have chosen to just sort of go off and chart their own path because you have created the conditions in the classroom to what they can study, what they like. And so I'm wondering if you could give some examples of what are some of the things that the students pursued, and were you their teacher in that regard, or did they go off on something like, you know, if it's an education course, could they conceivably have, you know, studied underwater basket weaving? That's just a crazy example, but I'm just trying to figure out, like, what does that look like? And then on top of that, I struggle with that notion of the open syllabus for students, given that like somebody said, I can't remember who it was, about I as a teacher am constricted because I am an agent of the state in terms of licensing and making sure that my students have been at least been exposed to particular content prior to becoming licensed as a teacher in the state. But I guess I'm more interested in if you could help me concretize in my mind what happens when a student kind of goes with that open syllabus.
Well, the practice is very different, and I'm actually recently engaged in studies of that, and I found also very, very interesting different students' approaches to that. Let me tell you. Well, let me start with the like what you already, Kristen, mentioned. The students, some students choose to study outside of the class, like autodidact, and they engage in that. Some choose, those who choose open syllabus, to study in the class together because they appreciate education together with other peers and with me. Some will become very conditional, depends on the topic, whether or not it's the topic of their interest. They will do that, they will come to the class. If not, they will do something what they think it's good. Some students, it's rare, but it's happened, create some groups and just study. So it's, I would say, it's kind of inside of outside, it's a kind of alternative. They meet together and they study together, but without me and with students that agree to study, because they need to more or less agree on the topics. But it's happened outside, and sometimes they come to the class as well. So it's all very diverse. Students treat this option more like another options that I had in class, which is prisoner of education, but for very interesting reasons, they don't want to admit that for themselves, or sometimes to me, or whatever, that they're prisoners of education, or maybe don't trust. They might feel that this is option is kind of dangerous, because if institution notice that, they may be punished for some kind of that. Anyway, it's still, I need to investigate that. But basically, they are not open syllabus. But they are more prisoners of education, which is they kind of forced to take class which have zero interest either now or in general. Now, hi Armando, that's great that you're joining us. In terms of the studying something else, it's happened so far. Again, the question is how much I notice or know about things. That's a good question. But I know a situation when I had a Chinese student who's from China, and it was a class for seniors. It was called Topics in Education. It's just the last semester before graduation of these students, where we actually together with the students developed all the most interesting topics from their point of view about education in general, that as a future teacher they want to know and discuss. So I had a student who chose open syllabus, and then she asked to meet with me because and to discuss that. When we met, she said, I don't know exactly what should I do for class. When she mentioned for class, for me it was immediately kind of a trigger warning, almost immediately, like, you don't need to do anything for class, you need to do for yourself. And she said, that's the problem. I'm not interested in education anymore. She was education minor. Her major was business, but she doesn't want become interested in business either. And I said, so what are you interested in? And she said, in computer science. I want to be a computer programmer. And I said, well, why don't you switch? And she said, what switch? This is my last semester. How can I switch? And I said, so what are you doing? And she said, well, already for 2 years, I'm attending informally classes in things in computer science. And so this is what I'm doing. And I said, okay, in this case, it's a good idea for you to switch to prisoner of education. She said, I'm not a prisoner of education. I'm a learner. I'm so much interested in education. And I thought for a moment, said, you are, it's true. And I said, well, why don't you write that you are studying? And I said, what are you studying right now? And she said, like Python. And there is that computer language. And I'm attending classes informally and studying that. I said, well, write about that you studying that. This is what your class is. And she just jumped and hugged me. And she said, it's such a release. It's like, this is what I'm a great, I'm in charge of my own education. This is my education. And it's just bureaucratically it doesn't fit to that. I said, well, who cares about this? Let's think about not bureaucratic issues, but the substantive. And I said, I cannot help you. I don't know Python, cannot help you. And she said, I don't need you to help me, but I just feel released that this is what I want to do. So things like that, indeed, at least I have at least one well-documented case when the students studied during that time something else, and I found that it's terrific. This is most important. One aspect that the students study, and I encourage them to consider that, it's whether or not they want to be teachers and explore that part as well in their education. Oh, Kristina, probably I missed something in you because your question is so profound and so deep and going in several directions. I might miss something if I miss addressing something.
You've answered the first part really well. The second part was the struggles that I have kind of as an agent of the state myself.
Yeah. Okay, this is something that I wrote about in constantly thinking about that. Let me start with some small anecdote. I lived in the 90s. I lived in California. And I forgot what this proposition was. It was mid-90s. It was big debates about. It was anti-immigrant proposition in the 170 something 8 or something like that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. One part of this proposition was like that governmental agencies should report illegal immigrants. And what was interesting about that doctors were exempt, priests were exempt, lawyers were exempt from reporting. So if you, for example, if a doctor has a client or a patient, I'm sorry, and the doctor realized that the patient is, or suspect that the patient is illegal immigrant, by this proposition, it was not allowed doctors to report. But for teachers, they have to report. So if you find that your student, like say in second grade, suspect that illegal immigrant, you must report to authorities. That proposition was accepted, but then it was challenged in the courts and was struck out, but not because of that. But that I started thinking about, is it bizarre that we are, like as a teacher, as educators, we're supposed to loyal not to our students, but to the state or whatever. That in a way, our society currently, probably around the world, does not recognize that we're serving to our students as educators. And we have loyalty to them, like doctors, like lawyers, like priests, and like financial advisors. We have high priority and loyalty, not to the state. And then I start looking at the oath, because I start thinking, is it interesting to create like teacher oath or educator's oath, like doctors have oath, in which the exactly expression of the loyalty to the patients. Do not make harm, first of all, to the patient. And I was searching on that internet about 20 years ago with my graduate students, and the only oath we found, teacher oath, it's about loyalty to the state in United States in 30s. I forgot which state that was, but the idea is that they were concerned of the communist kind of spreading communist propaganda in schools. And in part of that, it was they required teachers to have loyalty to the state. And I think we should start, I'm always thinking, we teachers, or educators in general, not teachers, to have a movement for educators' oath, in which we should pledge allegiance to our students, not to the state, not to any other agency, but to our students. And I think that will help. This is a Christian, trying to address that issue.
Yeah, that absolutely helps. That's such a great example. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Melissa, you have hand a long time ago.
My question is for Jim. Jim, I was wondering if you think we could make any kind of claims about how a democratic school environment fosters dialogic dispositions in students, whether it's dialogic disposition toward learning or dialogic dispositions toward kind of engaging with other people. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Well, Melissa, as I said before, I think dialogue develops organically, naturally in communities of free human beings. And so to the extent that a democratic school enables that, facilitates that, just by the nature of providing that free environment, yeah, I think democratic schools do foster that, as well as a democratic classroom within a non-democratic school. But then there are also some structured venues in which dialogue may be prompted, such as judicial committee, that where alleged infractions of the rules are submitted to hearings and group discussion, and in some cases those will get into dialogue. In some cases they're formal, stiff proceedings that may not. And then in what we would call classes, in our democratic school anyway, there are many regular sessions of groups that are gathering around a particular subject or activity. So let's call that a class. But all of the participants are there voluntarily. And so in that venue, they're free and can engage in dialogue without fear of being judged by the teacher or graded. Typically the person who's in a position of teacher or instructor, if any, is either a peer or could be an adult, but in any case, they're not in a position of any kind of civil authority or credentialing authority over the students. And so people are freer to be vulnerable, freer to venture ideas that might not meet with the approval of whatever authority figure is perceived or present. So those are some of the ways that foster it. I also think another way is that that there are many settings in democratic schools where there are no adults present. Now the schools I'm talking about are K-12 schools or pre-K through 12. And there may be settings where there's no adult present. I mean, that's common every day, many places. Many children assume that whatever adult is present or what adults are present are in positions of authority. So the absence of adults is yet another freeing factor that makes a dialogue possible. Now, of course, the dialogue among, say, 7, 8, 9-year-olds is going to be very different than the dialogue that would take place with 15, 16, 17-year-olds, but it's certainly dialogue nevertheless, and one step even freer than some of the other settings. Does that address what you're asking about, Melissa? And you've got quite a bit of democratic school experience. What are your thoughts about this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, thank you. That was helpful, thinking about especially the idea that students are, when they're not under sort of a feeling of watchful eyes, that it gives them more, they're not afraid to sort of really honestly share. I guess the other thing that you prompted in my mind is sort of the role of staff or experienced students in creating this dialogic sort of environment. Because when I think about some democratic settings or processes I've been in, they haven't been very dialogic, right? They might be more argumentative and just each person talking past the other person. Whereas other settings, I have found that maybe experienced students or staff will kind of open things up in a way like, does anybody disagree with this idea? If so, could you share something? Or, you know, just kind of those ways of engaging that seem to help push things in a dialogic setting, in a democratic setting, if that makes sense. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I generally do. I think cultural norms and cultural ways of being vary quite a bit from one democratic school to the next. And individuals, the individual adults, there may be, in some democratic schools, there may be a variety in styles of adults, one being very pedantic and another being absolutely wide open to any kind of direction that a dialogue might take. So yeah, I agree with you that the role of staff can be important. In democratic schools, though, I think there are also some things that don't depend so much on either cultural norms or the individual styles of teachers. In what we call our school meeting, which is students and staff, meets weekly. It's a legislative branch of government policy making, and those discussions can be more along the lines of rigid critical thinking and intolerance of things that are not, or they can be much more relaxed. Some democratic schools have consensus processes, either practically or formally, most not formally, but more practically. So again, styles and culture make a difference, but also some of the formal settings that that can set that tone.
That's very
But
good.
yes, I agree with you, Melissa.
Yeah, Eugene, and then I'll say something. Mhm.
Thank you. I just want to elaborate a little bit on what Jim said and share some observations. Like one thing that I was completely amazed, like our first kind of debates with Jim, one of the big issue, exactly lack of dialogue in democratic schools, because of course I couldn't recognize many things. But immediately what I recognized, how thoughtful children at the democratic schools were, both in my direct conversation with them, and also often we, like, especially some time ago, my students were interested and they met through the Zoom with Jim's children, including, by the way, some very young children. And one of the, of course, big immediately observation of my students were how thoughtful children were, all of them, and knowledgeable and thoughtful, deep, and so on and so forth. And part of that, what I was start thinking, it takes me like a lot of efforts to do what can be called dialogic pedagogy. And now I'm looking at that, and I would say what I'm doing is not so much dialogic pedagogy, it's dialogic therapy. And because I'm working against the institution, let me just give example. I'm teaching right now a class on cultural diversity in education, which consists most of the, except 2 students, most of them future teachers, and ask them on the first day of the class, how many of you would take this class if it's not required? Out of 34, it was 6 students only. Out of the 6, 2 students were not teachers. So it's basically 4 students, if you think about that. So, of course, if you're forced to get to something that nothing to do with, you think it's not to do with your life, of course, creating a dialogue, it's just a very difficult, genuine dialogue, very difficult task. But if you, in an environment where, what is Jim saying, organic environment, where there is a lot of negotiation, a lot of discussions of the things that are interested by the students. And it's many things happen by itself. Let me just give one example that I observed. I was there was some time ago, there was interesting book club that I think teenagers, kids organized in the gym school, and asked permission. I think we were with Anna, asked permission to attend that, and the children after discussion allow us to attend. And I was amazed. For me, it was like, wow, this is great. It's such a dialogic space there when the kids discussing books of their interest, and ideas just really enjoy being part of that. And I was not as much as educator, or at least if I'm an educator there, I was very organic. I was mostly as a part of that of book club. So there's many places when invisible, sometimes places maybe, where this dialogue happen natural way, how it's happened in everyday life as well. Whether or not it's affecting culture, individuals, and so on and so forth, but it's a very natural place. And I agree with Jim, and there are places where this dialogue almost like will happen by design, like judicial committees one place, or assemblies, it's another place, when some kind of controversial issues is discussed, controversial for the participants I'm talking about. So in this case, I'm just back to the gym, and dialogic pedagogy, in a way, it's more like dialogic therapy, or the dialogic struggle against monologic institution and monologic circumstances in which students and educators find themselves. Thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that we are talking about the different settings. Like we are at the university working under very conventional, predominant laws and regulations. And when you ask Kristen, or Dragan asked about what are the liabilities of the professors in democratic, or teachers in the democratic school, Jim will elaborate. It's a question that comes from the conventional educational approach where everything is top down. And when monologue in the Bakhtinian sense, as authoritarian word that has the last word, to subdue everybody to that, is the governing culture of the place. Dialogue is always in certain ways distorted unless it's outside of the like it's not part of the system. It's in between in many ways how it's done. But in a democratic school, that's a free school, as Jim School or as Summerhill or as Sudbury Valley School, where there is nobody over to dictate what you are going to do and put the last word, or a evaluation or fire you or something like that. There are possibilities for many different forms of and genres of dialogue. In our article, which is the interview between Jim and me, we kind of try to systematize in certain ways what dialogues. Many dialogues are very spontaneous negotiations between students about what they are doing, how they're going to do, or playing in the sandbox or whatever. They just are there. As something what Bakhtin may call it ethical ontological dialogue that happens about issues that matter to the people who it matters. Nobody else is supposed to come into and tell people how to talk and what to do, which in non-democratic or conventional schools, you always have to have moderators to kind of like direct people how to have a dialogue among themselves, which immediately is a sign that it's not completely a free environment. Now, whether that's good or bad, or when it's good or bad, that's a different issue. And then you have dialogues that are, as Jim said, very procedural, because they are about something that people have to solve as some kind of legislation or some kind of other negotiation about organizing a field trip or some program, where it's not something in the moment of the situation right now, but some kind of planning or some kind of people give themselves some further goal and then constrain their dialogues toward that goal, which is a different thing. And the whole cultural, so it's to notice what is dialogue and how it gets manifested in different situations. That's something that we still have to study, I think, because there are so many different very interesting examples what dialogue does or can do and for whom. That's so what I wanted to add just. So I see Dragana and then Armando have their hands up.
Yes, thank you very much. This is very helpful for my understanding of democratic schools. I wonder, what can you say about the role of parents? Because I see democratic schools, because they're relatively rare, as private schools where children go by choice, either by their choice or choice of their parents. So I wonder, how do you see parents as part of that democratic community? And if you saw any issues with that?
Okay, I think Jim should answer that question.
Yeah, that's a good question, Dragon. In my experience of democratic schools, and I have visited many of them and studied many of them very closely, there's a lot of difference among the schools about the role of parents. At the Circle School, we acknowledge that parents are an integral and crucial part of every child's life. But we view school as the purpose of school as a place where kids can practice independence from home and family, among other things. And so in order to foster kids' independence and autonomy, the school doesn't routinely feed back evaluative narratives about a student. We don't do report cards. We don't hold regular parent conferences after the first year. So the role of parents is to be parents, to understand the school and to support kids' lives at school. There are exceptions to that, but one of the things we say to drive home the point to parents sometimes is that you're paying us not to tell you about your kids. The idea being that one of the toughest things for parents to give their children is independence from parents. So in our school, the role of parents, we have an active social program that is after hours events that are for families. So we foster community beyond just the student and staff daily community. But the role is generally to understand that and support kids' independence at school. Does that get at what you're asking about, Dragana?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
And Armando, please. Armando is
Okay.
you before you came as author of one of the very important articles in our special issue. So please.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. Hi, everyone. I want to ask to Tim about something he said, that democracy is spontaneous or naturally organic. And I want to know if you think that democracy is spontaneous or naturally organic as dialogue. And if it isn't, democracy is not spontaneous or naturally, how could we develop a free dialogue in this not spontaneous democratic regime? Or to start a democratic school, someone needs to somehow manipulate this situation to lead a relationship between children and parents to a democratic situation. So I want to know, what do you think about it?
That's a fascinating question, Armando. I do think dialogue emerges naturally, but I don't think democracy does in automatically. That is, in pre-traditional societies and in traditional societies, democracy is not a prominent feature. I think democracy arose only with modernity and is an essentially modern idea. It's carried forward into progressive and even post-progressive values, but only emerged historically, I think, with modernity. So in that sense, it's both, it developed organically, but I wouldn't say that it's automatically going to emerge naturally. Also, I guess I think I would, there's a big difference between democracy and what's going to develop in a small group and how it's going to unfold differently in a very large group. This is not a question I've thought about, but one that I have is related to a unique feature of the Circle School among democratic schools, and that is from our founding in 1984, we've had two purposes formally, I mean, written into our corporate charter. One of them is to run a school according to certain principles, the democratic school. The other is to demonstrate the feasibility of democratic education for widespread adoption. And one of the problems I've wrestled with, theoretically, not practically actually, is, well, could we plunk down a democratic school in a pre-traditional or even traditional society, and what would that look like? And is the essential feature of what we're doing, is it democracy, or is it what we refer to at the Circle School as practicing life? That is, should a school resemble the ambient culture, whether that's a democratic society or not? Does that make sense? So if one were to replicate the Circle School, for example, in a nation dominated by traditional culture, would the replication entail democracy, or would it entail a system of organization that more closely resembles whatever society the school is embedded in? Fascinating question. What do you think about it, Armando?
Yes, I'm thinking about this, and I have to find some resolution for this question, because we born in a society and we are pressured to be educated. And I'm thinking about this, to have this consciousness about freedom, we need to be educated. And how we can understand freedom without education in our society. And sometimes I think that democracy needs to be educated, needs to be taught for people or who will decide about this. And I think I understood a little bit about your thing, that we can do something like democracy, and the movement turn spontaneous by people that started to organize through dialogue, something new for them that is something like democracy that they created, not something that we created for them. Yeah. And I am understanding this way that the democracy and dialogue could be possible if we create some situation that people take the power of the situation and create their own democracy, like they understand is good for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can I just quickly embed myself, and then I'll give word back to you, Jim. I think one of the biggest revelation for me in studying this Scandinavian Oslo school was this difference between liberal democracy and illiberal democracy, or freedom and democracy, because democracy is a system of ruling. Krasi in Greek means ruling, and democratic collective can bring very illiberal laws for themselves and compel everybody. It means what we decide here has to be compelled on everyone, whether they agree or not, that with whatever procedure is how the decisions are made. But once they are made, they could be very illiberal for everybody else. So one of the things that we are talking very often here is really what is the degree of freedom that the student in a democratic school has to exercise something that Berlin, so a Russian, Jewish, British philosopher talked about as negative freedom, or freedom from, like what's the bubble around each student where they have absolute decision of making without being compelled to do something by their environment or whatever, that's democratic or not democratic environment. And indeed, some non-democratic societies with a benevolent dictator can provide more freedom than some democratic societies where the rules are done in a democratic way. So democracy is not freedom immediately. It's a way of ruling that supposedly can provide equal rights of input into decisions, but decisions themselves, once they are brought, are compelling to everyone. And that just means how much of that individual freedom. That was a huge point of discussion among the high school founders of that democratic school in Oslo when they met together, because they had a streak of them that was very progressivist in their understanding of what education is, but not really liberal. They wanted to make everyone just follow whatever the curriculum is given to them by the state, because they were connected to the state, but then make themselves police there, make themselves not be supervised by anybody else, but by themselves. In that sense, not changing the approach, that's progressive approach, but just who is who are the people who are executing that, not somebody from the outside or other authorities, but themselves, versus those who thought that people had the right to be free to decide about themselves. So that's a very interesting. So please, Jim, now back to you.
I just want to note that at least for the Circle School, democracy is not a primary commitment of the school. And that we call ourselves a self-directed democratic school. I think all three of those words are misleading about what we're doing. But I think, at least for the Circle School, our primary commitment, or the most foundational principle, is that a belief that people are born with an impulse to strive, thrive, and grow. And democracy happens to be a useful form of organization to lead people to what the Circle School expresses as two primary values, which is personal fulfillment and engagement in society. And democracy is the way that we have developed to help foster those things, and that's the role that we think schools ought to play in society. But I think I think there may be others in democratic education who would share the idea that democracy is not our primary commitment, but it's a useful tool and a good descriptor.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jim. Dilipa, please.
Hi, yeah. So I thought I want to share the experience we have in Sri Lanka running this what we call a democratic school, and how we sort of govern ourselves within this space with the children and the adults together. making decisions, regulating our environment, the adults and the children having the same, how do you say, the voting rights or the speaking, the freedom to question things. We as adults in this space sometimes have concerns about what the children does, and children can have and do have questions that are raised to us about what we are doing. So we sort of help each other to regulate the environment together. So that's how our space works. And when we so we are also preparing for an interesting session sometime later this week, and that is to do with citizenship. I mean, there is a forum that we are supposed to speak on citizenship, and all that is going on in Sri Lanka right now. Everyone questioning, do we actually have a democracy as a form of governance in Sri Lanka at all? Sorry, my space suddenly got a bit noisy, so I'm just walking out. Explain what democratic education is, because immediately people think that it's our role is to make citizens that operate in a democratic environment and they know what they're supposed to do. But in the school, what we are trying to do is to use certain democratic principles to help children relate to their environment and thrive and grow, pursuing their interests and passion. It's very right-based. So, you know, in democracy, whether it's as a nation governing model, rights is an important element of it. And so is our school. So it's quite a right-based approach. So we do talk about children's rights quite often, and we try to always remember what these children's rights are, what human rights are, and then we actually engage with the children and children with us as well. So we, as adults, are, except when it comes to health and safety, we don't have a veto in this in our school. So there are times that often our ideas do get turned down by the rest of the children for some reason or the other. And also, the other thing about rights and freedoms is also the respect. So it's like freedom with responsibility. It's not freedom to do whatever you want, irrespective of everyone else around you and how it impacts the other. So freedom does come, but with responsibility. So, for example, a very simple example of our space is quite small. So when a group of people decide to do something, and say two of the children opt out and they want to do something else, and one group has to have some quiet space, and if that is a larger group, then they get the facility to use, and the others have to step out or be quiet because the larger group wants the quiet. That doesn't mean the other people have to stop what they're doing. They're opting out, but they need to respect that this larger group is doing something that needs some quiet space. So that is then dialogue, discussed rather. Okay, so how do you want to use this limited space? This group needs some quiet time. Do you have what you're proposing to do? Does it make a lot of noise? Is there some other space that you can find in our compound that you could do this? Or can you shift to something else that doesn't disturb each other? So if in a way there's conversation, dialogue happening to sort of
live and let live. So on one hand, they are, as children, learning to operate in a democratic country, but at the same time, it's not. So it's this mixed bag. It's not, as I think, as Jim said, it's not our responsibility to be teaching how to be democratic, but we're sort of practicing democratic principles in order to help children learn and thrive and be the best they can be. That's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip, a lot. Yeah, this is a very fascinating question about the learning through practicing, actually. So the questions come for the children or for the students, so for everyone out of the practice itself. And one of the things for me that helped me with this whole work on many different aspects of the special issue is to understand that education really takes place on two different levels. Let's say the level about like what are you learning or deciding to learn, and the other one is this deciding or meta level that what we in both progressive and conventional education take away from children, from students, is the meta level, and maybe in contemporary conventional, even from the teachers, because all decision making and about the practice itself and this reflection of how and why you're making a certain decision takes place on that meta level, and it's very, very important aspect of education itself. It's not something outside of education. And that kind of came more and more prominently for me in the whole issue. Yeah.
In that sense, Anna, would you consider that second piece, what you were talking about, the meta level? Do you think that that would be similar to what scholars have called like the implicit curriculum? So to me, it doesn't have the negative connotations of the hidden curriculum. So it would be more the implicit as opposed to the explicit. Would you see the same thing?
I think to a certain extent it may be the implicit curriculum that you don't think at the moment when you are doing that is education, but something about it only, but not necessarily. I think sometimes it's actually people really aware that having this ability to be on the meta level and direct their own life is very important also content, which is explicit content, what we can do, why we can do it, is it good, is it bad, and all of that. So I think it depends on the situation. I don't think it's a blanket implicit or blanket explicit. It depends. And maybe some process, maybe, I don't know. Dragana.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking while listening to you, how do you protect democracy or whatever the goals are, as Jim said, in the context of democratic school? Because obviously we are talking now about how community can relatively easily, as we saw in the last couple of years, fall into non-democratic, oppressive, and so on environment. And I'm also, when I look at my students, for example, or any kind of group work, it is relatively easy to give either priority or power to individuals who seek those powers or overpower others. So I'm just interested in the role of maybe educator when you notice that what is happening in democratic school is actually what you think is non-democratic.
Jim, please.
I can say how the circle school protects its democracy. I'm not sure how it applies to university classrooms, but the way we protect it is by building into charter documents, the school's bylaws, a structure of checks and balances that in spirit mimics the checks and balances kind of organization of government of the United States. And so what we do, we have a board of trustees, 7 people, that is not empowered the way most boards are empowered. Most boards of trustees have comprehensive authority over every aspect of their organization. Not true of ours. Ours has 3 missions. One is to preserve the governing autonomy of school meeting, which is students and staff. The second is to preserve students' civil liberties. And the third is to preserve the school's long-term assets, such as real estate. And so school meeting is again, that's staff and students, is the sort of the primary guardian of the democracy. But our board of trustees, which we refer to as a quiet guardian, monitors what's happening at the school meeting level. And if any person or agency of the school violates any one of 12 explicit ends, what we call ends we seek, that's ENDS, ends we seek, which is in our bylaws. If any agency violates that, for example, if school meeting adopted a law requiring every 12-year-old to take a civics class or a math class, that would violate one of our 12 ends, which says students shall be free of curricular coercion. So if there's a violation of one of those principles, the Board of Trustees is required by our corporate charter to intervene. And if and when the Board of Trustees intervenes, it's empowered at that point, first to do an investigation, second to issue a statement of breach, as it's called, third, give school meeting a chance to respond and address the issue, and then fourth, if all else fails, to take over campus, checkbook, facilities, whatever is necessary to restore the governing autonomy of school meeting. So that's what we do as a democratic school. At the university level, that would require a commitment from the university institution that you all are unlikely to get anytime in the near future, I think. So I'm not sure how you preserve the democracy within a classroom, except by declaring it, I suppose, in whatever way you're free to declare it. Other democratic schools do not do that. For example, Sudbury Valley School has only one governing body. We have 3 with checks and balances. They have 1, which is the school meeting itself, students and staff. So that body is free, literally free under their charter, if it wanted to violate principles of democracy, to change the school from a democratic school to something else. Tradition and the history of the school make that very unlikely, but it is possible in their system of governance.
Thank you. And Eugene?
Thank you. I'm actually interesting. I want to bring a little bit slightly different view on our what we're discussing right now, because we're mostly focusing on the 4th definition of democratic education, which is democratic collective decision making. But I'm personally much more emphasize the 5th principle, 5th understanding of democratic education as self-education. And in this key, and self-education understood broadly, it's not understood like, as a student, I'm making all decision by myself. It's in principle, it's true. But as a student, I might actually either delegate that decision-making to somebody else or do it with help of others. Let me bring some interesting examples. I found like myself, when I started doing this democratic dialogic education, initially I was really trying to do what Kristen, you referred to open syllabus. And then I realized that it's not a good idea to do it only one regimes. I realized that my students have very different relationship with their own education. For example, my students like that somebody forced them to study. It's true. that they won't study what they want to study, but nevertheless, they want somebody to force them to study. Some don't want to make decision about what to study. They want somebody that told them what to study, even because in part of that, it makes a lot of sense. If I, let's say, invite you to visit, let's say, Russia, maybe not now during the war, but anyway, you might be excited about that, and then I ask you, where do you want to go? And I said, you might say, I don't know. I trust you. You will bring in the different places. Maybe later I will say, oh, you know, I noticed this. I want to go explore that more. But initially, it's okay that somebody else wants to study. Some students want to be completely traditional students, like they want more, like my metaphor of that. It's like, getting a driving license. You don't care about, as a driving license, if you want to learn how to drive car, driving license is kind of credentials to certify that you more or less safe for yourself and other people around on the road. You may be not perfect driver, but you still good enough. And as driving a car, you might care about like how car works, or why there is such and such traffic laws. You don't want to be, in this case, in position of learning driving a car. It becomes more like you want to know the skill, but you don't want to be so-called critical learner about that and disassemble both practice for the car or fully understand how it works. It's you, you can decide a level of engagement. So that's why I'm for diversity of these different approaches. And some students might don't want to make this democratic decisions. They want authoritarian decisions making. In my view, it's fine unless it's they make the decision and it's conditional. When they decide, no, I don't want any more authoritarian principle, I want something else, fine. But they should not be like trapped by this. But in my view, this diversity of the approaches and diversity of decision-making, including collective decision-making. Like, for example, let me give interesting example in my classes. My students usually at the end of each class meeting, they decide what they study next, and they making speeches. By the way, that part of the dialogue, right? To make speeches about convince their peers to vote on their topic. Sometimes, by the way, there is dirty politics going on. They say, if you vote for my topic, I will bring food and only give food only to those who will vote for my topic. Or if you vote for my topic today, next time I will vote for your topic, whatever. Besides substantive dialogic kind of decision-making, there are political decision-making, some dirty politics involved in that, which is fine. But some classes, I had the situation when they decide, you know, we don't want to make all this decision. It takes a lot of time. Eugene, you must set all topics that you think is important for us, and we stick with them. Okay, that's for me, it's fine. As soon as they know that this kind of authoritarianism that they want, first of all, they want it, they make decision about that, and it's conditional at any time they say that's enough is enough, we are switching to something else. Rather than constantly focusing on this like one type of structure that was decided forever and it's difficult to change it. Or there are certain areas when it's imposed on all students. This is kind of limitations, what could be collective decision-making, what should not be collective decision-making, or it should be partial and for some and certain times. I think it's a very, very important questions, an interesting one. I'm always back and forward with Jim kind of thinks about how much it should be formalized and how it should be not formalized, or how it should be easy to change, difficult to change, and so on and so forth. This is, I think, fascinating questions, and I feel it's very interesting. It's by the way, Jim, you're raising a very interesting issue, why there is democratic institutions on the kind of K-12 level and not at the university level. And it used to be, by the way, it's not historically, we started with them, and they, by the way, both University of Students and University of Masters were very much democratically run. They were not authoritarian institutions, neither from masters nor students' point of view. It's emergence of bureaucratic things university of credits, there it became hierarchy, strong hierarchy. But it was not like that when they were, for hundreds of years, they were run, university was in other, it was very interesting, democratic institutions in non-democratic, otherwise very, like it was kingdoms and so on and so forth, but universities were one of the democratic institutions were rather like blossoming in the air. With all these excesses, they had, they were very much illiberal democratic institutions, it's true. But they were democratic institutions where things decided by majority, usually either students or faculty, depends on the type. But then it disappeared. But it's interesting that nowadays it's very difficult to create university, that democratic university, in the sense what we're talking about, like governance or recognition of self-education.
Yeah. To return to this, what Eugene mentioned, different ways of meanings of education for people, and not only in general, but you may not want to know everything about the car when you're learning how to drive, but in some other areas of your life, you do want to know everything about everything. So it's also a moment for the student. That was also a very big discussion in the Oslo, the democratic school, about what I called later pluralism and monism. Does what is education has to be the same for everyone, even liberal, or can it vary? Can we have a different ways of, so some students do it this way, some students do it this way, they can switch, change depending on various cultures. So pluralism was definitely a minority of people in their school at that time, which is very interesting. It was 1967, and big students movements are brewing all around the world. Most not in the high school level, but these were the high schoolers. And they still had a huge monistic, so to speak, streak among themselves, that once we decide what this is, then everybody has to follow it. School is only school. It's not in one of the speeches in a very dramatic meeting, one student said, we know what school is not a therapy session, it's not a nightclub, it's not a place to just hang out. We know what school you just have to do one thing. But there were reactions to that. It says, why not? For somebody, it could be like a therapy session. And they had at that time a beginning of a huge problem with drugs in European and American society. And for some of the students who were actually expelled from many other schools, this was a place, a haven where they could be what they are and just hang out and sing and play guitars or something. And for some other people, it was a serious place of studying for some other causes in their lives. So that idea of what education is could be different, and pluralism allows, it's a tolerant view that you can define, the student can define education for themselves. That's that liberty. And if it may mean for me something different than it means for you. That's a very interesting thing.
I have a question for Armando, for you. So you, it's like that very interesting case that you described in Brazil started around kind of use of democracy for solving problems with violence that was almost like endemic among children, not only among children, but also adults were doing a lot of violence that you documented against children. But the question that I have is whether or not this democratic democratic governance around relationships among children and adults, did it spill out in kind of educational issues? Like, for example, when kids decided what they decided to study, or with whom they decided to study, should they go to the classroom or should not go to the classrooms? Something like that. Can you explain that, please?
I don't understood well. What is your question? The point of your question? What do you want to know?
Mm-hmm. Well, what you described, one example, vivid example for me, the students, children discussed and decided like how they should be treated. And they together decided almost like rules about, like, for example, that adults should not abuse them, they should not yell at them, and many interesting things. And that's interesting. But do they also discuss like what they want to study there? Like, my understanding, there was a kind of a school there as well for them to study. There was classrooms. So will they also decide what to study, what they want to study, and what and how they want to study?
So what has happened there at the time was that they forced to go to school and to apply some contents of study and activities that they don't understand and they need to do, they are forced to do. And when we started to discuss the rules of the ONG, with children, they found this way to escape from this shape of school that they are forced to go. And they wanted to build a new possibilities in the ONG, the institution, but they don't know clearly what they want to study. But they know that we want to be free to do something that we want to do. And from this point, they started to choose something to study. For example, I had a girl that decided to study about anthropology because she found in the internet something about anthropology. And so I want to understand what is anthropology. And we started to discuss about this. And they started to choose about the type of activity, not exactly the content of studying some subject to study. And this was the starting point that we could work with them to talk about some content of life as anthropology and how to build a newspaper in the institution that they could organize the news in the institution and to produce something like this. We have this plurality of choices that Anna said to us, starting advice in different ways that they started to choose what to do, but they don't organize it well in some strict point of view of contents of school, different things about life. And this was very interesting for me because I understand that dialogue is not something that you add to a democracy, but is the core of democracy. And also you have dialogue, through dialogue, democracy is a possibility to rise among people. And now I think about this and I'm thinking that dialogue is very important to how said Jim, the spontaneous, naturally way to raise different things for culture among people, as democracy is a possibility. Taking dialogue as the core of the process, not something you add in a different process. I don't know if I answer your asking.
No, thank you, Armando. You answered my question very well, and thanks. That's very interesting. That almost like a democratic process kind of spill out from one area to another area. That's very interesting for me. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
What do you think about this? The dialogue is the core of democracy, and you have to have a true dialogue to promote true dialogue to defend democracy. Not, I disagree about rules to protect democracy. And I think we need to protect dialogue, true dialogue, the free expressions and possibilities to discuss and argue about your desires and what you think, and create something new that is going on about true dialogue and new shapes and forms of democracy that we don't know yet.
I think that dialogue enough. Oh, sorry, because you have to have real rights to make your decisions, and that nobody else is going to overrule. You know, like Kant was living under Frederick, whatever number king, who allegedly said, "You can discuss as long as you want. At the end, you have to do what I tell you." So I think the rights and sovereignties, that was the issue in the school that I was describing, that you have the last word. There is nobody above you to tell you, like, that's one thing. Another thing is that dialogue has sometimes a counterproductive to making decisions, because you can always reopen and reopen and reopen. And for democracy, which is the rule of how we are living, you have to make these decisions, which means you have to stop the dialogue at some point and decide to now take the vote. And even people who wouldn't agree and who in dialogue would continue to talk would have to now comply. So there is this tension between making decisions and dialogue. They somehow not always go together, but dialogue is necessary, I guess, for really good democracy to deliberate all the aspects so that the decision would be really well informed. But at the end, it has to be a decision.
I agree. We need some rules to live together, and even to build this way through dialogue. But I believe that rules can exist a short period of time and need to be reconstructed, rebuilt, and through the contradictions and the dialogue among people. And rule is needed, but a short period of time that we can discuss and rebuild the rules for a new short period of time and go on in this way.
That's very interesting. Yes. Eugene. You're muted, please.
Thank you. Thanks. Always forgetting. There is always interesting relationship between dialogue and democracy. Definitely they need each other, in my view, which is like I came to democracy not for the sake of democracy, but from dialogue. In order to actually have a quality of dialogue, people have to be free. And democracy exactly regimes that allows people, or as any other regimes, to make people free. That's one thing. And of course, for deliberation, deliberation require a negotiation requires in democracy requires dialogue, but there is limitations for, as Anna pointed out, between them. Well, first of all, dialogue belongs to a realm of the war. It's a war. Like and democracy, it's a realm of action. That's one difference. We have freedom of speech, but we don't have freedom of action. And that's one important difference. Another important thing, it's democracy is based on idea of legitimate of imposition on people who disagree. And that's very important principle. Democracy is power. Power, what does mean power? It's to impose something on other people who do not accept that. And I think it's very, very important principle, and which is anti-dialogic at the end of the day, because it's overrule people who disagree, and it's accept them as disagreeing, but they have to subordinate to that, whether or not they want it, and because it's legitimate, because it's done through the fair democratic ways, one way or another. There is tendency to claim to eliminate democracy through the dialogue. Let's say, let's talk, and convince each other. This is so-called sociocracy, which is very funny. They call it sociocracy. It's like, it's done through the deliberation. And in my view, it's nonsense. First of all, the sociocracy term itself says sociocracy. Cracy means power, imposition through the socium. And they just masking that imposition. What I like about democracy, that it's very clear about we imposing. And there is legitimacy on that because it's done in fair way, and it's listen other people, and then it make decisions altogether. And yes, you have to subordinate to that, despite that you disagree. And is it completely fair? No, it's never completely fair that it's happened. And sometimes democracy has to limit itself because of the rights and limitations of itself. But nevertheless, it's happened, and that's the principle. And what I like about democracy, it's very open, it's in your face, rather than other attempts to say, oh, let's not have impositions, let's have dialogue. We need to convince everybody. And it's possible sometimes convince everybody, but in many ways, disagreements is there, and then it becomes hidden imposition. When just people sick and tired of these conversations, and also they feel guilt that they're holding other people. And in my view, that's not good, because it's hiding this issue of the power. It's become informal power, rather than rather than power is make it visible and discuss how fair it is. And this is great, in my view, in democracy. But there is tension, inherent tension between dialogue and democracy, and I think it's very healthy tension, and I think it should continue to be tension. And in certain ways, democracy and dialogue incompatible with each other, and both needed each other. This is very strange relationship, being in need each other and being incompatible with each other. And of course, in each particular case, these tensions has to be resolved in a very contextual way. And but this, in my view, there is no way in principle to resolve this tension.
That's a really interesting point, Eugene, about the tension between dialogue and democracy, and the necessity for both. The thing that I've come to the realization with, and I don't want to admit it, is that dialogue is extremely messy, and that there's really no way to kind of get as much as we would love to have, and I don't know if I actually would want to live in a society where everything is dialogued. I was just thinking about what the consequences of that would be. Basically, we would be living our lives through a giant Dostoevsky novel. And I don't know if that's necessarily where we want to be. But on the other hand, there is something very important, and I it's one of the things I just was finishing doing some study or just some analysis, and actually shared this with Eugene, Anna, and also Jim. Paper I'm writing on that some stuff I had on Summerhill School. There's an interesting documentary, if you haven't seen it, called Summerhill at 70, which shows a class meeting practices of Summerhill School, and a class meeting, school meeting, excuse me, much different than class. And it's very interesting in many ways how democracy operates there, in that there is a certain degree of recognition that there is limitations to it, I feel. And especially in the need, in the rights of individuals to call what they call special meetings to discuss emergent problems. And I just find it very interesting the way in which the tension exists there. I'm very interested to know what I sent Jim my paper, so I'm looking forward to him seeing what he thinks. But yeah, there's that tension between dialogue and democracy just is absolutely fascinating. I'll leave it there, but I just the messiness and the need for occasionally, I think, for people's voices to be heard. I think that's really important, and that's what I feel sometimes is difficult in democracy, is trying to figure out how one's voice can be heard in situations in which, for example, there might be procedures that need to be taken, and sometimes those procedures might not be sensitive to specific voices, and I find it very interesting that to think about these tensions and to open them up and discuss them, and particularly when it comes to, for example, issues such as particularly children who might be, I don't know, bullied or something like this. There's a lot of issues that I feel need to directions that we could talk about the role of escape valves in democracy, dialogic escape valves or something. I don't know, but just a thought that just came to my mind as we were talking.
Very interesting.
One of the interesting questions, and I think we little bit talk about that, mention, is how much both dialogue and democracy is both culturally biased and individually biased in certain ways. Because let's say both of them required certain verbalism and certain fluidity in expressing yourself, articulating your own ideas, have this persuasive power and persuasive skills, and so on and so forth. And that's required, again, certain personalities and certain cultures that support more verbality rather than non-verbal communication and non-verbal kind of participation. And that's in itself is very, very interesting question. I don't know if people like Jim, you have observations how kind of deal with that situation when and of course, like, for example, you're dealing with the little kids sometimes whose abilities are very limited, both verbal abilities, also cognitive ability, emotional abilities, and maturity levels, and so on and so forth, which requires both participation in dialogue and democracy. On the other hand, it's exactly dialogue and democracy is a place. It's a wonderful milieu where to promote this kind of skills, maturations, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, it's kind of limiting. That's interesting. And certain cultures, there is definitely, we know some cultures are more promoting verbalism and many democratic and dialogic qualities. And some cultures are rely on something else. And the question is, maybe we can turn things around. Maybe there are different forms of existence of democracy and dialogue, which is less verbal and less this and that. And we just maybe don't know, or maybe not notice that they exist and maybe emerging, and we just it's less visible to us. So Jim, I would curious what you think about that.
Well, yeah, sure. I think the ability, the verbal skill and ability is crucial to dialogue, but I think my experience with kids is that that's the easier half of the equation. The harder half is what happens before you speak. That is the process of fluid thinking and what I would call introspective skills. So being able to access what you think and feel about the topic at hand is more troublesome, I think, for the kids I encounter than the fluidity of expression. I think you can teach and learn. You can learn that fluidity of expression through practice by being immersed in a culture like at the Circle School, where policy is debated publicly, and every day the Judicial Committee is discussing principles. I mean, that's it's a very spoken word and also written word. It's a very language-oriented setting. But kids who have been in conventional schools are basically trained to sit down, be quiet, wait until someone tells you what to do, and then do that. And so you lose the need for introspective skills. You don't need to know what your opinion is about this or that. You don't need to know what are your interests, what are your passions, what are the things that you want to do, what are the things that motivate you, what are the things that motivate other people. All of those, I think, are actively suppressed by conventional education, not just thwarted, but actively suppressed. We sometimes joke at the Circle School that we should never admit a student who has hit the middle school bump and become alienated by it, because part of that alienation is learning to keep your head down and keep quiet and not have good access to your thoughts and opinions. So to me, I think the making people free from a very young age so that they're free to develop originality, to understand what they think and feel inside, is a first step. And then the fluidity of expression can come later.
I think of this as that meta level of education where you kind of can reflect on what you think and what other people think, or how does that imply further things for you, and that's what's taken. I always want to repeat this quote, this student from the Jerusalem Sudbury School, who I met last year when he was already just in the graduation class. He came to the school when he was in the 5th grade. And what he said is, when I came to the school, I fell asleep for 6 months. And then I woke up and started to live. That's his quote. I thought it was so profound, because something that also A.S. Neil was saying, that people who lost their agency and this ability that you're talking about in the conventional school need sometimes to regain that, to heal themselves from that, to kind of like start living, as this boy said, or young man. And that was really something to think about, because that's where I think really the most important aspects of taking responsibility for yourself and directing yourself, or knowing what's not only what you want, but why you want that and what you want to do with that, and all of that. Actually, that is the heart, I think, of education.
The self-knowledge.
Yeah.
One thing that I'm doing as a part of my dialogic therapy, as I would say, exactly with the students that I have, many students like that we're starting not discussions, not necessarily with articulating the views, but voting on some possible positions and also discussing whether or not there's enough options there, and maybe initially I creating the options, and then they start seeing what's missing. For example, I don't care. It's legitimate. Not only I don't know, but I don't care about this issue, which has become, and it's initially easy to like vote on or put your name under particular things, and then not necessarily knowing why you're leaning towards that, and together with other people to just try to figure out like why you're voting on that, on this kind of thing. Even if you think I don't know, like what's the meaning I don't know of this, or I don't care, which means it requires other people to say why they care about this, which is interesting also in other things, or even join somebody else in non-verbal way, just doing something like that. And I noticed that they're doing that, and that's important first things of the, as Anna said, becoming alive, because you start developing your own orientations to the life. You initially for finding yourself what's your position might be there, and listening other people to align with them and say, oh yes, I think this is why I'm actually leaning toward that, or even change your orientation. But that's fact, because many students initially say, like, I remember saying like, why even you asking us, tell us, because why is it our ideas or opinions or feelings are important?
Thank you, Luciana.
Yeah, we are not kind of there to, we're students, we're ignorant, we are this and this and that, and like, why are you even asking us about that?
Armando.
I was thinking about this, what Eugene said, and this verbalization, and how do you deal about the problem of anxiety, the need to take the voice and it continues saying what you need to say about you have issues to discuss, and the needs to learn how to listen to the other. How do you to tackle with this problem? How children can learn how to listen to the other with calm and interest in understanding what the other is saying. At the school, for example, Jim or Eugene.
I think it's almost has to be by observing it. You have to have it as cultural value, that you listen actively, often reflecting what you've heard the other person say. I mean, it's a social norm, a cultural value. I don't think it develops organically, naturally.
Let me add to that. And again, we're talking about children, and I'm talking about young adults. One of the interesting things surprised my students, and they write about that in the exit reflections at the end of each class. And they continued throughout semester. One shock for them that people think differently than them. And people who are normal. Just say, I didn't expect that normal people, of course there are crazy people, but my peers are normal, and they accept them immediately. So, which is very interesting. They call it normal. They are normal, like me, and so which means they're reasonable, well-intended, and so on and so forth. But they think completely different than me, and it's interesting. Instead of rejecting them on thinking that, well, they're stupid, how can you even say that? It's become interesting because it's become a paradox. Like they're normal like me, and they think differently. And it's usually happen on non-systematic way. In another way, like today, Armando thinks differently than me, but tomorrow it might be Jim, and now I'm with Armando. So there is no particular pattern on that. but it's so strange for them. How can people can think differently? And it become very, very interesting. And they very much emphasize one of the biggest value of the class is learning from each other, which is such an interesting for them. And in this case, in my view, this really emphasize and appreciated value of listening.
Mhm.
We
Yeah.
do have, since the 1980s at the Circle School, we have periodically offered a course for mainly for parents, but students have done it too, called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk, which has been a classic part of our culture always.
Right. Something that occurred to me while you were talking, Amanda, and from your whole experiment that you described in your paper, is that what may have been the such a profound change for the kids in your center is that their dignity was restored. And I think that that's the thing, that when people don't have threat to their dignity, which means people will they feel that they are taken seriously, that other people respect them, and so then they not only don't have a need for violence, but also can actually quietly listen to the other, because they can then go out and listen. They don't have to create a barrier and block for others to hit them, you know.
I think it's very interesting that Eugene said to listen to the other, learning from them too, and the way to recognize each other in this through dialogue in this movement, and to build a new relationship. And when we started to build the rules first with the child, they recover this I don't say dignidade, dignity to live together and to build something different for them. And we started with the rules, and after they assumed these rules as something that they created, and they started to get some power to create something different. And we did not have time to go too long with this process, because I was interrupted by the politicians. And but I learned a lot from this process. So I want to say I was just graduated, and I was beginning to learn with my projects too. I was very difficult to me to understand theory in practice, and don't confuse the real people with the theoretical people that I saw in theories. And sometimes I had to struggle about this confusion. And so my article says about my mistakes more than about the right things I did. And I think that we can learn from mistakes too, and is something interesting. But I think that happened something positive in this movement with mistakes and right things that I did. And I agree with you when they started to build the rules of the institution, they recovered their dignity and had to understand what is this, because what is dignity, what is right? But I grew up in the world that I don't have dignity. I was hurt from my dad because I don't deliver drugs at the time, and I was abused from my relatives in my one house, in my one home, and I don't know what is dignity. They needed to understand what is new thing. I have rights and I have dignity to build a different world for me. And this was very interesting. Although I don't understood at the time deep how I can understand now.
Mhm. Well, thank you all. I learned so much through working on this whole issue for so many years, and I definitely have different view on everything now than when I started in the beginning, on different relationships that we were discussing today, and I guess we could discuss and continue all the time. So I think it's time for us to conclude and put this recording for other people to see, and then maybe we will get more discussions through some other media. Okay.
Good to see you. Thank you
Good
for organizing this, Anna.
Thank you for
Yeah,
coming.
thanks a lot for organizing, and nice to see all of you. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you,
Bye now.
everyone. Sorry to arrive late. My
It's
mom is
don't
about
worry.
to. So
Okay.
thank
And
you very much
the
to
best,
take part.
bye bye.
Bye, bye, Jane.